Hello, welcome to our third LinkedIn Live session on why Innovate. If you want a spoiler alert, the basic answer is your business depends on it. In the first two sessions, we talked about how to get started with innovation, with ideation, and building a business case. Today, we're going to talk about what happens when the rubber really hits the road. And trust us, it gets really, really messy. So as the famous innovation guru Mike Tyson said, and everybody has a plan until they get punched in the face. And it gets very gruesome. I'm sure some of you have had that feeling. And today we'll talk about how to handle this through the use of right processes that's going to help you overcome issues. But there's another piece that we're going to touch on. We're not going to talk too much about it. Is the cultural piece that I want to highlight. It's very, very important. When you get into innovation, when you commit to innovation, your commitment will be tested because you're going to fail. And if you're not failing, you're not innovating. And you need a culture that's accepting of failure, learns from failure, that there is vulnerability in your organization, that, without those fundamental pieces in place, I think my colleagues will agree, you will not be successful in innovation. But let's move on. And today, we're going to talk about the development processes and how development can help you overcome this. Is Agile, the very popular Agile method, the right process for you? Or is Waterfall the old school process, the process you should go with? So we're going to talk about that, debate that a little bit, and we may surprise you a little bit with what you're going to hear. But before we jump in, let's have some introductions. I'm here with two great colleagues, Angus and Beth, who have probably forgotten a lot more about innovation than I will ever learn. So Beth and Angus, go ahead and please introduce yourselves.
Oh, good morning or afternoon, depending on where you are, everybody. I'm Beth Samplatsky-Martori, and I'm a CMO and partner with Chief Outsiders. I have 25 years plus experience in using Vasegate in innovation. I learned my processes at Philips, where you might imagine had very structured and rigid stage gate processes. After I left there, I've also implemented phase gate processes at Jacuzzi, Brands, and Overhead Door. And my background, especially here at Chief Outsiders, I do a lot of work with consumer durables and B2B businesses. And so what you might be already thinking, okay, this one's familiar with the Waterfall method. And if you're thinking that, you're right.
Thanks, Beth. I'm Angus Robertson, a fractional CMO with Chief Outsiders as well. I've had a little over 20 years of B2B tech and B2B SaaS marketing experience, primarily in product management, product marketing. I'm very passionate at product market fit, and I've done product launches my whole career. I also started off in telecom, which manufacturing hardware, so very much the Waterfall method, but I've been involved in my last three companies with B2B SaaS, and I'm complete Agile convert now. So feel free to ask Beth and my opinions about one versus the other. Anyway, it's interesting looking at the B2B SaaS world. One thing I've found is there's some awesome innovation that happens and awesome disruption that happens, but I do tend to see the same mistakes made over and over again when it comes to product development and also testing. So want to dive in there a little bit.
Great. And I'm Ahmed Abaji, fractional CMO with Chief Outsiders. My background includes a lot of dabbling in consumer products, over-the-counter products, some pharmaceuticals, sporting goods, apparel, and footwear. Today, I will be acting as the host and really asking questions and moderating this discussion. One thing we really need from you is your questions. Please send them during the live event, and I will bring them up to Angus's and Beth's attention. And they said, bring us questions that will surprise us and shock us a little bit. So we're looking forward to that. So we're going to start with Beth. Agile started in tech. Now it's in a lot of different fields, even beyond product development. Marketing teams are using Agile. Waterfall has been around forever. Some people say it's dead, and I have a feeling Beth is going to argue it's not dead. But Beth, can you please ground us to begin with a definition of each, and maybe how they compare, and if you have an example, I'm sure that will be great.
Well, thank you, Amit. So the waterfall method is very linear, right? So if you look at the graphic that's up here, the waterfall or traditional method, you have all the steps, and you have to complete each step before you go to the next step. And the sign off at each step is at an executive management team level. So it's governed by the business. So the product development teams report to the business, and then the business signs off on each of those steps. Finally, it's very resistant to change. So they put in a lot of engineering change management things for a couple of reasons. One, you don't want scope creep, right? Because then the project's not delivered on time. But two, sometimes you can't deliver the spec. And when you can't deliver the spec, you need to go back and make sure that everybody's in agreement that you're changing it. On the other hand, the Agile method, look at that. It's not linear. It's nice circular. It's all going. It's basically values rapid iterations, the team autonomy, and flexibility. And basically how this project is managed is the business gives the team priorities, and then the team plans both the deliverables and the outputs, and is delivered in 2, 4, 6 week type sprints. The team sets those time frames. And the goal is to deliver value to the customer fast and frequently. Each sprint then is approved not by an executive management team, but by the customer. And so once the customer accepts it, then the value is delivered to the customer, and they move on to the next sprint. They also then will, if something wasn't quite right in that sprint, they'll maintain a backlog. And so the only time they go back to the business or some sort of steering team is if they have a question. So that's how that's managed. Very different governances. When we first met and we started talking about this session was named Agile Product Development. and I'll credit Angus with that very catchy title. We had to talk about it, right? I had never considered that we weren't going to talk about the waterfall or the traditional method because of my background. And as I talked about earlier, I do consumer durables and B2B manufacturing. I grew up at Philips in the lighting division. And let me just tell you a little bit about the kinds of products I developed, right? At Philips, we had a term we called non-passive failure, term of art for explosion. And that actually is a failure mode of light bulbs. And many times the light bulb explodes, causes a fire, and in some cases, more than just burning down a building, it can cause death. Since I've been at Chief Outsiders, I worked at the company in aerospace that made critical airline components, flight critical. And what flight critical meant, at the very least, if they were missing or gone bad, your flight was grounded, which is bad enough. But other times the flight would crash to the ground. So when you do that, you need to make sure that everything's right before you release the product. So the example that I'd like to talk to you about today is while I was at Overhead Door, we developed some garage door openers. And those garage door openers, we were doing something fairly complex, right? It was a $65 million project. We were developing 3 garage door openers for the Genie brand and 3 for the Overhead Door brand. And we had some really specific things we were doing. First of all, garage door openers have safety and regulatory considerations, much like the other 2 things that I talked about. There have been deaths caused by garage door openers too. So it used to be before they had the beams that put it back up, right? You could get pinned underneath. So, and the other thing is holding up a garage door that that can come down if a spring breaks with 500, 1,000, or 1,500 pounds. You got to be careful about that too. So anyway, those are the safety and regs. In this case, we had long lead time components. So sometimes just ordering the components can take longer than the development cycle. And right now, many of you may be understanding the long lead time component piece. We were working, this was an IoT project more than a decade ago. So we were working with outside contractors for expertise because we did not have that expertise. So we were managing many different design streams at the same time. And finally, we put a really significant design constraint on the project, which said we wanted to use all the same internal components for these garage door openers, but we wanted the industrial design to be very, very different. So those are some of the considerations that put us into the waterfall method. Now, how did we make that work, right? In the last example you showed, you got to get the design specs just right. So we had more than a dozen studies that we had that allowed us to set the right constraints. And we did things out of the Design for Six Sigma and Lean playbooks that really helped us. So one of the first things we did was go to Gemba, which means go and see, literally. So we went into the field and we watched how both professional installers, because that was the overhead door brand, and the sales guys wouldn't sell it if the installers didn't like it, because in the dealers. And then the Genie brand was a DIY brand that was sold at retail, and we needed to make sure that consumers could install it. So we did a lot of work with Go to Gemba. The other thing is we did a lot of de-risking of the plan and looking at the plan. We used methodology called a PPA, a potential problem analysis. And so that's a place that you can look at everything and look at the design constraints. And then finally, one of the things that we used to make sure that we had the requirements just right was a quality function deployment tool, another Six Sigma tool called the House of Quality. And the House of Quality is a tool that you can use that allows you to look at customer specifications. So you put your features on, you talk about then what that spec is, how you're going to source that spec, so the particular product components, and it allows you to prioritize and do all those features. The other thing is, since we had so much research, one of the things we had was a pricing set of research. And we were actually able to regress back what people would pay for each of the features. So we were able to set cost tolerances to make sure that we met our goal. So anyway, there are tools that you can use to get your plans right and make sure that you can stick to them. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Annette.
All right, thank you, Beth. Really, really great insights. I have to say, The Attack of the Rogue Garage Door is not a movie title I want associated with my business. So Angus, as our Agile expert, can you help us understand basically how Agile works? And if you have an example, that would be great as well.
Absolutely. And I thought those were some great tools, very insightful. I really like the House of Quality in particular. And Ahmed, I'm not sure I'm the most Agile expert out there, but I am definitely passionate about Agile. And here you can see a representation at the very highest level of the approach that is Agile. And of course, I would say almost every B2B SaaS company I've worked with or been involved with embraces Agile as a core component of how they innovate and how they bring products to market. And it's really cool what we've seen over the years as the infrastructure to support SaaS has been put in place. Everything from the public cloud and infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, a lot of the JavaScript libraries that are available, even the enhancements that have been made in web browsers, especially browsers like Chrome, which is now, of course, inside Microsoft Edge. But these infrastructure really, along with an approach like Agile, allows some very fast iteration and innovation when it comes to software as a service. And what I like about Agile is some of the core principles that are involved in how Agile is defined. So that includes individuals and interactions over processes and tools, working software versus comprehensive documentation, customer collaboration versus contract negotiation, and responding to change versus following a strict plan. So those are some of the reasons why I'm so passionate about Agile. And I like this framework because I think it's a way to break down complex problems. And software is more complex than ever. You're always going to have bugs in software, but you want to preserve that user experience. And this is a way for individuals at that story level to come up with their own innovation and capability to support scale, but also provides a structure to break down that complexity. So user stories are short requests written from the perspective of an end user. And you can see those here. Then epics are collections of these user stories or stories that represent a new feature or performance enhancement or even a bug fix. So for example, a user story could be, I want to, from a customer perspective, register for a new website, an e-commerce website, so I can browse for different products. And in a 2-week sprint, which is fairly common in the world of SaaS, a user story should only take 1 or 3 days to develop the code for, and actually includes the testing for that story as well. And a user story should not be more than half of the time for a sprint. So in this case, 5 days in a 10-day sprint, because then you're getting into too much complexity and it undermines your ability to do an effective estimation. So I think this is a really great framework for starting to build up and solve complex problems from an end user standpoint while keeping that innovation core to what you're doing, and tying from a theme perspective or a theme or an initiative perspective, tying back to those corporate goals or OKRs, objectives and key results. So all in all, I believe Agile is a good way to be iterative, to be including test, to support users and their individual capabilities and innovation, but also support structure for larger, more complex projects at the same time. Tough equation to put together.
Great, thank you, Angus. I think one of the areas that's interesting is, regardless of what method you use for development, at some point people get the itch to bring that product or service to market, right? So it's we want a little bit of confirmation what we're doing is right, and Agile maybe doing more testing on an ongoing basis. But either way, testing becomes very, very important. And I'll just share a little nuance with you. I was in an organization that didn't have very established new product development processes. And we were talking about testing products before we launched them. And one of the product managers came to me and said, "Hey, Ahmed, you know what? This product we are launching, every year we go and test it with heavy users of this product. And we launch it and it doesn't sell. And when we test it, they tell us the product is great. But for some reason, after we launch it, it doesn't sell." I think that's a story a lot of us have heard before. We have experienced it. So testing is this big area of confusion. Some people trust it a lot. Some people don't trust test results when it comes to, all the way from concept testing to, how we test our products. So I'm very interested in how each approach handles testing. So I'm going to start with Beth, and if you can enlighten us a little bit, what is the proper way to think about testing?
So anyway, you need a robust test plan, and you need to stick to it. So in the methodology that I'm talking about, you typically need to put physical products in people's hands and or a testing process. And we'll talk about both. And alpha testing is where you test the very, very first set of products. And that alpha test, you're using internal people because you're going to find more things. And then you go back to the drawing board. And then you do beta testing where you put those products into your close customers or a set of consumers that you have control over to make sure that that all looks good. And so to get these alpha and beta tests, it's a little easier these days than maybe 10 years ago. But you do soft tools, which are expensive, but not as expensive as hard tools. And or now you can use 3D printing. So you can actually create. But what you want to do is you want to get prototypes out and in use and look at them, how they're used, and see all that. And the other thing to remember about testing, you need to fix what you find. One of my mottos is, you only get one chance to launch a new product right. Okay, and so you have to be really careful. You don't want to make like those little exceptions that said, okay, so maybe 1 in 10,000 when I put that garage door opener is going to open my neighbor's door because we didn't thoroughly test all our software, as an example. But and that's from the garage door opener. We had that happen in the alpha test, and we had to go back and fix the frequency. So I'm not kidding. Big discussion, and yeah, we delayed a month or two to get that done. But anyway, we need to though look at ways to test to speed up the testing. And that's why this design of experiment slide is up there. So I've been involved in a lot of process and assembly operations where either, the process has a lot of inputs, as in lighting, right? So even the pressure in the factory when you built the light bulb made a difference. So you need to know what all the factors were. And especially the example that I'll talk about within lighting is we were developing a new light bulb for halogen. And I don't know if it's because light bulbs have changed quite a bit, but in the old days, they were in these really heavy glass containers if you got a spotlight or a floodlight or whatever. And there was a reason for that. And that was to contain that non-passive failure because halogen tended to have more of those than some of the other technologies. Well, anyway, we had a process that we could put the halogen bulb in a soft glass deal, but we wanted to move it into a different container shape and had to do all the testing for that. And we were moving it to new equipment. And so that's where I got introduced to design of experiments, because we had to analyze every single failure method and make sure we accounted for that in the test plan and that we had solved whatever that would be caused by that before we could launch this light bulb. And so if you think about that, really, really tough deal. And I'll tell you, design of experiments is above my pay grade. Okay, so we got the really gearheads involved in that. But being aware of the tool and asking about it is really a good thing to be able to do it. And we were able to take off 2 years, we estimated, by using design of experiments. I've also used it both on light bulbs and the garage door openers, looking at life testing. So to make sure you're simulating the right variables in accelerated life testing, right? Because if it's supposed to last 10 years, you don't really want to wait 10 years to figure out that it does. So anyway, that's some tools for testing.
Well, it's the rare executive or dev team that believes testing is cool, but as Beth highlighted, the right approach to testing can quite literally make or break your product, especially in the case of Beth's light bulbs. An approach I favor is this idea of test-driven development, where you actually turn the development and test ethos on its head, and product management collaborates with QA, and the dev team writes the test before they write the code. And if you write the test against the user story or the product requirements, then when you write the code, you know that you're writing code or software that is going to meet the requirements, and you're testing for those requirements. So the first goal is, of course, to get past the test. And then once you're able to pass that test, then you can work on refactoring and refining your code. So I think this is a very cool approach because too often testing in QA is given the short shrift and development takes extra time. And before you know it, you've got way too little time at the end of the dev cycle to do QA or alpha or beta testing with customers. And you're taking a product to market that is nowhere near ready, which just causes all sorts of reputational issues and churn, and even just back and forth internally with support and escalations with executives, which is the most miserable thing to deal with. Not that that's ever happened to me. So with Agile, you have that approach for speed, scale, and innovation, and test-driven development. You can ensure those features work and match those product requirements. One other item I'd also highlight, and this aligns to both test-driven development and also Agile, is the idea of continuous integration and continuous development, or continuous testing. So in other words, having an environment where you have a continuous test running all the time, where as much automation as possible is used for these user tests or feature tests or unit tests, and that as features and as dev teams are ready and complete, their sprints or complete their user stories, they can check in their code and it's automatically integrated and tested as part of the overall system as it iterates forward. So again, you're not waiting till the end to test everything. You're testing story by story along the way and able to spot potential issues before they become a much bigger problem that you have to deal with. So I think the combination of Agile with test-driven development and also continuous integration and continuous testing can be a really valuable combination.
Thank you. I find all of this so fascinating. They sometimes, if you lose track, then it may get confusing. But if you understand the basic principles, I don't think we're talking about very, very different things. Very simple concepts like, if you're going to test something, make sure you can learn from it and make sure you can fix it, right? So how do you design a test that's controlled, that there are not too many parameters in play, and you can figure out, what's driving the outcome. Scientists are great at that, right? So when they develop researchers, when they develop very controlled studies, one of the sort of the parameters of success in the world of science is if one researcher tests something and does something in one lab, the same thing can be repeated in a different lab and the same result is received. So that's like the sign of a really good research. Sometimes people deal with, okay, how do I do testing in lab environments to replicate real life situations, because you don't have the product to put out there. You cannot put the product out there because it may cause the death of people in the garage, for example. Like I have experience, developing OTC products. Like, our developers would put the bottled vitamins in accelerated aging processes, basically in ovens that had humidity in them to figure out when the expiration date could be. And that was one way. And when I was at Spalding, the goal was to make the most durable basketballs that would withstand, a minivan driving over it in the driveway. So we had a torture machine that the developers had designed, and would take this ball, squeeze it like you could never squeeze it, and bounce it off the wall, and keep doing that thousands of times until it like almost shredded to pieces. But every business finds a way to follow these basic principles. But I think if you are mindful of it, maybe you can do it better and more consistently. So let's switch gears a little bit. I want to a little bit understand how to align these methodologies to the right business. And Angus, I'm going to turn to you. What would you say about Agile's philosophy, and how do you apply it to a business, and where it can be most useful?
Yeah, for me, I'm a big fan of this concept of customer development, and for SaaS startups, but any company, I think, in particular, can benefit from this concept. I think it's more about principles again, or philosophy. And for SaaS startups or any company, it's such a powerful concept because you're building your product with your customer in mind. Such a obvious idea, but it's so funny how we get into our bubbles and we start just going back and forth between the product and the QA and the dev teams, and you can get lost pretty easily. And ultimately, the goal here is to achieve that aha moment within your target customers and really be able to capture that excitement and that energy of that aha moment. And what I found in working with developers, the context of the problem that we're working on and the pain relative to the persona is really powerful. So the ability to get the dev team or the research team and the UX team in front of those customers in a regular basis really makes all the difference. And I found that their motivation, their investment actually can increase significantly. All of a sudden, they're working nights and weekends to get things done because they want to feel like they can solve this problem and this pain So it's funny that sometimes it's good for sales and marketing just to get out of the way. And often what'll happen is that the product or the feature will come out sooner than you expected, and it'll come with some innovation or ideas that you didn't plan for in the first place. And that's just so exciting when you bring some requirements to a dev team and a QA team and a UX team, and they come back with something that you hadn't thought of that the customer or the prospect just absolutely loves. It's such a cool feeling to see that across the teams as we work together. So ultimately what we're talking about here in terms of the principles of customer development is discovery. So understanding customers and the needs you can satisfy, and then validation. So you have the product and you can satisfy the needs, and that's validated with the customer. And then the creation. So your product can satisfy all the needs for MVP or MLP, as Ahmet might say, most lovable product. And then you get into the company building. So now once you've validated that and you've got that excitement from your core group of targets or prospects and existing customers, you have that demand and you can justify adding the sales and marketing resources to build the support for your company or the product to scale that demand. So another good approach that I think really works for overall philosophy and approach for developing products and launching products.
Great, excellent. Thank you. And we have one question that I'm going to bring up here. It's a really good question that I think a lot of businesses struggle with on a constant basis. And when they may think they found the right answer and it changes again. The question is, what role does marketing play in the development of product testing? And where specifically should market research happen within the timeline? And I'll open this to either Angus and Beth or both because it's a big, broad question.
So in the world of B2B tech, this is just my biased opinion because I came from product marketing and product management. I like to see product marketing aligned with sales and focus on the market dynamics and the competitive landscape, and product management work very closely with individual customer requirements relative to those business use cases and manage the roadmap and the quality. So I think that product management absolutely needs to, for each of those requirements and the user stories that dev puts together, there needs to be that testing that's done upfront. That has to be there before the development begins. And product management, in my opinion, needs to be very involved in that.
And adding on to what Angus said, from my perspective, marketing definitely needs to make sure in the places where I am, it's either product management or brand management that's putting out the marketing specification, depending on how the company is organized. But they're the ones that have to determine whether or not the specification actually meets the benefit, right? And so at that point, you can go back, and that's where the alpha and the beta test come in. So overall, we had a lot of market research to set the specs. But in this phase, that's the market research that you need to do with alpha and beta testing. And then if you're making a trade-off, you may want to even go out with quantified testing to make sure you're doing the right thing. But that's how I would handle that. How about you?
I'll add maybe different spin to this answer. Looking at it purely from a cultural and attitudinal perspective, one of the success factors in new product development is how teams work together. That the teams truly look at this as a cross-functional process. While I agree there is I in a team, the team needs to know what each member of the team is doing. So there should definitely be transparency. There should be absolutely no question about who is doing the market research, who is leading the testing. That is the first step in my mind. Whatever way you're doing it, there should be complete understanding of, yes, we need to do this, and this person is doing it. And then if that baseline is not established, I would focus on establishing that baseline first before I figure out, okay, what's the right testing to do. because I think it's very important to have that transparency, to have that cross-functional attitude from a cultural perspective. I hope we answered that question. And I'm going to move to sort of the last part of our questions or our discussion points, which is, having absorbed everything what Angus and said, I'm going to turn to them and say, how do we decide, right? How do we decide, whether we want to use Agile or Waterfall? There are points I love in each case, and there are points I, don't like as much in each case. Help us figure out, how to decide. Beth, do you have any insights on this?
Yes. So when you're looking at it, there are 4 factors that are on the slide that we can talk about to help you choose your NPD methodology, right? Whether you use Agile, Waterfall, or as I see in the comment, a hybrid, because depending on where you are in the development process, both may make sense. But the 4 factors are the company culture, the team skills, the product that you're developing, and sort of your customer input. And with the company culture, right, where you are on your industry life cycle. So a lot of times on newer industries, Agile makes perfect sense because you want to get there fast. There's nothing to holding you back. In more mature industries, you can have sometimes more data that says, oh, maybe you need to slow down. I talked about government and safety regulations, right? You get an accident, there's a new regulation. So a lot of times it's where you are in your industry life cycle. It's also how you make decisions within the company, right? In the company culture. So you can have a management team that is very uncomfortable with delegation. And that's going to sort of override everything and kind of put you into the waterfall. They don't want to just give you some business priorities and off you go, right? And it's also how you manage your budget, because there's more sort of predictability around what the end result's going to cost with Waterfall. With Agile, you have team and resources, and you keep going until you're done, although they have budget management authority too. Team skills with Agile, you're giving a lot of autonomy with those teams, and typically those teams have higher level skills, right? Because they're operating as a self-governing unit. Whereas in Waterfall, you can have a higher level team member managing beginning developers, and because there's this little command and control, you can train people and get them up to snuff, but they can work on the big project. We talked a lot about product and the tolerance for errors, mostly around safety. But there's also, what does it cost to test, right? If you have to cut tooling, you don't want to be testing every 2 weeks, right? You want to test at an end of a development cycle where there's enough value added for the customer. We talked about product component lead time. So if you have components in there that's going to take longer than the cycle, you need to figure out sort of where you're headed to get that done. As opposed to in SaaS, right? You got all the product components right up here and right on the team. And so that makes that just wonderful. A lot of times there's product launch costs involved, much bigger than sort of the test use case rollout. If you have a real product sold at retail, for example, not only are you investing in all the product and the product launch, your partner is also investing. There's a reset. You've got to put new signage up. A lot of times there's either buybacks or markdown funds. So just getting the product out there without making people aware of it. And then you have the awareness campaign. So if you're going more mass communications, so there's that consideration. There's first to market. As we know as marketers, first to market wins usually. And Agile sort of gets you there faster in many cases. And then finally, it's how you do road mapping, right? In the case of Waterfall, it's more feature-based. I talked a lot about features and what are features worth. And in Agile, it's more outcome-based, right? Angus talked about what is the test result, right? That's the outcome. What are we trying to deliver? And then finally, it's how much is your customer involved, right? What does the customer value? Do they want value quickly, right? Or do they want you to get a lot of value because they're going to have a lot of investment before they go ahead and make their investment, as well as then in the test, right? In a waterfall, you have a lot of customer involvement developing the specs, some customer involvement in testing, and a lot of customer involvement in launch. Whereas with Agile, you have them involved all along with those very frequent releases. So that's some things to consider, whether you choose one, the other, or a hybrid approach, right? If you're developing a product that has software in it, perhaps, you want to think about how to do that. So thank you.
Great. Thank you. We're almost at the end, and I'm going to conclude by asking both Beth and Angus, who came in, with different perspectives from, Agile and Waterfall. What did we learn? Are there any aha moments, key takeaways? Is this all very different, or are we talking about some of the same things? Angus, we can hear you.
Thank you, Ahmed. In my experience, I think Beth really summarized it well with regard to Agile versus Waterfall, especially as it relates to some key dependencies like hardware releases or features. I also think there's a risk reward and a significant consideration that needs to be made in the investment, because Agile is hard to pull off. But I do think that combination of Agile with the user stories and the epics, the test-driven development and customer development overall is just a powerful way to look at things. And while many companies, especially in the world I come from, claim to practice those best practices or use those approaches, I find more often than not that is not the case. And it's surprising, and I think it goes to your point about culture, Ahmed, that it's so easy to be drawn internally and think about just releasing things on a certain time frame, as opposed to understanding the real value that is being brought to your market and to your customers. And at the end of the day, I think you just have to continually fight against that inertia, because it happens more often than I think any of us want it to.
Beth?
And so adding to what Ahmet said, what's really interesting there were a lot of similarities, right? You still need to get all the customer input and understand the customer requirements, right? And have a place where you're going. And it's just a matter of how much are you delivering before you release. I think we talked about the importance of testing, right? And test plans, and how to make sure that you really do understand your customers and that they really are getting the value out of whatever it is you're developing. So I was also very heartened to see a lot of the similarities between the two processes, and that both processes look for ways to speed up getting value to the customer fast. They're just different, right? They're applied with different methodology and maybe different timeframes. So I thought this was a very interesting exercise, and there are times to use Agile, right? Somebody put about, using Agile in marketing. Absolutely, right? So you need to understand when and how to use each approach and maximize from there.
Great. And I think my takeaway is, never go for the hype. Always challenge the status quo, challenge what you're doing, learn about different ways to do it and make thoughtful decisions, whether you want to apply those or not. Just don't go after it because your competitor started using one method and you have to use it. Make your own decisions. But most importantly, be ready to get punched in the face, because no matter what you do, failure is part of innovation, and you need to be able to handle that. So thank you very much for attending. We really appreciate it. Thank you for the questions and comments. And we have our previous sessions and blogs we've written on these topics on chiefoutsiders.com, where you can read more about innovation, what we and other colleagues are writing, and you can reach us through our website as well. Thank you for joining, and thanks, Angus and Beth.
Thank you.